All right, so we're in AP Lit, and we've just defined allegory and alliteration, and Ella is defining illusion for us. And I apologize, I was distracted, so would you do it one more time so I can?
An allusion is an expression designed to call something to mind without mentioning it specifically, and Shakespeare alludes to biblical stories in his plays.
Yeah, so that two things right there. There are four areas that writers use, Western literature use allusion from. And one would be literature, like Shakespeare. You can allude to him, like Out, Brief Candle, that's an allusion to Shakespeare. Any biblical allusion that, the poem about his blindness, he talked about that one talent, that's an allusion to biblical. What are the two other areas that are commonly alluded to by writers? You got literature and you got Bible, but what are two other areas? Yeah.
Would TV and film be in that?
Well, probably, I would put that under literature, TV, movies, film, yeah.
Shakespeare?
I would include that under literature. Yeah. I would put that as a separate category. History, if somebody's talking about their Waterloo, then you know what happened there, you know that it adds meaning to that. And of course, the other area would be mythology. Not less so today, but that the Romantics used a lot of that. So, again, that probably provides more content than even something like alliteration. Anapest, this is very narrow, but back up.
I said a metrical foot consisting of two short or unstressed syllables followed by one long or stressed syllable.
Okay, I'm looking at my podium because I can never remember these. I don't know what it is. So I have it taped to my podium whenever we come to these discussions. There are 6 basic metrical feet in English poetry. Really 4 that you need to remember, and one of those 4 is anapest. So what would be an example of the 2 unaccented followed by accented?
I said to the lonely sea and two that would be the unstressed.
Yeah.
Love.
And write this down. The word intervene is an example of anapest meter or rhythm. Intervene. The 2 are unaccented followed by vene. The phrase in a hut, H-U-T, in a hut. The first 2 are unaccented, the second is accented. And a meter is what poets used to always use. When we went to free verse in the 19th century, it was used less. But it's useful to know the different types of meters possible. And they're really 4: iambic, trochaic, anapestic, and dactylic. And then there are 2 others, spondy, which are 2 accented, and you can have just a word that stands out, that would be monosyllabic. But again, these are not the kind of thing you're probably going to remember or retain, but it could be helpful. So we'll move on. Anaphora, Lily.
A figure of speech in which words repeat at the beginning of successive clauses, phrases, or sentences.
Yes. Example.
I said in the I have a dream speech, it's constantly repeated, I have a dream, that, and
Okay, yeah. The thing we're going to look at in a minute, I gave it to you Monday. He says, in 4 connecting clauses, there were 2 wings of the building. There was the garden. There were the skirts of Lowood. There was the hilly horizon. That's anaphora. It's the repetition of the word there. And in this case, we'll look at in a minute, it creates a certain kind of mood, or it contributes to the meaning of the poem, which is or the passage. So just keep that in mind. That's anaphora. How about anecdote, Emma? Sure.
I said a short, amusing, or interesting story about a real incident or person.
Example?
I don't have an example.
Where would you go? You usually go there once a week. I hope you do. And you listen to somebody talking, and these kinds of people enjoy anecdotes. Who would be that person, and where do you go every week? Your church pastor loves that. The pastor loves anecdotes. Anecdotes think those are useful for illustrating things. How about antagonists? But
An antagonist is a person who actively opposes or is hostile to someone or something.
so what would be an example? Yeah, what's your difference?
The evil man in the story.
It's not too different, I think, yeah, we can connect with that.
That's an example, bro.
Yeah.
An example would be Darth Vader in the Star Wars.
How about some antagonists we read about this year?
Grendel.
Oh yeah, I remember reading that this year.
And
Grendel's mother, don't forget
What
about
about this
And the
year?
dragon,
Judge Pension.
which is worse than
Uh,
both of them.
yeah, Judge Pynchon is antagonist, Abigail is one that popped in my mind immediately. How about in the, All the King's Men?
Is really the bad
You
guy?
see the protagonist. That's a little different, we can't pick out, maybe Tommy
Jack's the
Dutcher.
bad guy.
Anyway, how about antithesis?
I just said that was the opposite, that was by definition, and, or
The
like opposite
opposite.
things in a story, and so for my example, I
How's this
said,
not?
Marcus Brutus and Mark Antony in Julius Caesar.
Like the opposites?
Yeah,
Okay. Did anybody find a poem or anything like that where you have,
As a man proposes, God disposes. I found that.
okay, that's a good example where you know, in a sentence, you could just, pit one side of the sentence against the other and they're kind of opposites. That would be antithesis. You know, things that are juxtaposed together, yeah.
oh, I wasn't, sorry.
Alright.
I wasn't raising my hand.
All right, so why don't we do, apostrophe?
A punctuation mark used for possession.
Yeah, that's not the one we're looking for.
I thought so as I read it. That's the, I don't know why. I
You
did
should
that.
know apostrophe, we did it beginning of the year.
Oh gosh, that's not a good sign here.
All right, Clayton remembers.
I have an exclamatory passage in a speech or poem addressed to a person, typically one who is dead or absent, or thing, typically one that is personified.
Right, so it's someone or something that cannot respond. Tiger,
Oh,
Tiger,
yeah,
Bernie
yeah.
Bright is an apostrophe. Lamb, the little lamb who made thee. He's
With
addressing
the narrator asking, who was it? And
Macbeth.
no, the first we just read this year. When the old man died and he's like asking for him
Oh,
to
so
like,
Thomas Evan Gable.
yeah.
Okay,
It's a little bit
it's typically used for poetry because the whole poem is usually addressed, but it doesn't have to be the whole thing. What were you gonna say, Will?
Would O Holy Night be one?
Well, it could be, if you're talking, oh, holy night, if you're talking to the night, that would be an example. If you're talking about the night, it wouldn't, but
Or she's just
that's a
talking
good,
about-
good point.
Talking to her now.
How about archetype, Raleigh?
Archetype, I had a very typical example of a certain person or thing,
Okay,
but when I tried to research like an example, like it kept popping up with like heroes that are like typical, like the common man becomes a hero, so I just wrote that Jean Valjean in Les Mis is just an ordinary man. who becomes a
so
hero.
it's sort of a, yeah, how did you put it?
Or I said like, an example of like an explorer could be Huck Finn, like different types of, or like people who go on a.
So it's a commonly used, it's a commonly used character or a commonly used, subject. The Garden of Eden, the Fall of Man, these are archetypes because you see them repeated in literature. You can't, I don't think you can make a list of all the archetypes they are, but really what every new story you read is a takeoff on a previous story. You know, we just take the same stories and we update it and change it and adapt it. So the kind of character, even a villain is an archetype. You know, the guy that plays the bad role, or the guy that the buddy, the friend. That's Oliver in Song of Roland. He was like the prototype example, maybe not the prototype, but he was the example of the friend who never left his friend, the sidekick. You see those in westerns, you see those in detective movies. So that's an archetype, when you see the same type of person or setting or thing repeated over and over in literature. How about assonance?
A relatively close juxtaposition of similar sounds, especially of vowels.
Yeah, and I like especially, that is what we're looking at. We're gonna consider assonance only vowel sound. So it's a repetition of vowel sounds. How would that look, what would that look like?
Like high rise in the bright sky.
Okay, all of them share that vowel sound, the I sound, but they don't, bright and light rhyme. So we wouldn't call that assonance. Bright and sky do not rhyme. We would call that assonance. Or you could even call it slant rhyme or near rhyme, or there are other words to it. Emily Dickinson used that kind of rhyme, not complete rhyme. She liked it, and it's created by assonance or consonants, where you have vowel sounds in one case and consonants in the other. Again, it contributes to meaning, but it'd be hard to write a whole paper just on the assonance or the alliteration of something. These are contributing factors. How about ascenditime? Yeah.
It's the omission of or absence of a conjunction between parts of a sentence. And as an example, I said Vinny, Vidi, is.
That would be without the conjunctions. Polysyndeton would be, I found that in the passage that you read, and it contributes. Asyndeton can sometimes suggest a lot of action, quick action. You know, you go from one thing without conjunctions to the next. It's kind of, it leaves you kind of breathless, yeah.
Mr. Sullivan pronounces it accident and polysynthetic.
Sounds good, I don't know. He's a Latin teacher, he probably knows that better than I do, but I've always said the other. All right, attitude, Eve.
A settled way of thinking or feeling about someone or something, typically one that is reflected in a person's behavior.
I think the word tone is also, I think I use them interchangeably. It's one of the most subtle things you can look for, and they're gonna be asking you to look for it. So how would you give an example of that? What is an example of tone?
I just said for the Titanic goal that his tone was not like more like sad, but it was. I guess I said in a poem at a funeral, the attitude is sad or morose.
I liked your example, Convergence of the Twain. It wasn't indifferent, but it was objective. It was clinical. It was kind of cold, maybe even mocking. He was angry, but you would expect, if you think of tone as about the Titanic, your expectations are he's really sad about 1,500 people. Well, no, he's not. That's not what he's addressing. He's looking at the pride of men who built the ship, and so he analyzes it very critical and objective way, like scientifically. It's like what do you call it? The guy that the coroner, you know, who look at the body without any kind of emotions. It's not somebody he knew, and that's sort of that's how tone can differ from mood. The mood is kind of sad, but the tone is not. How about ballad and ballad stanza? I want you to do both of those.
Okay. So ballad was a poem or song narrating a story in short stanzas. So for as an example, I did The Night Before Christmas. And then ballad stanza is a 4-line stanza in iambic meter, in which the first and third unrhymed lines have 4 metrical feet, and the second and fourth rhyming lines have 3 metrical feet.
So the reason I put the ballad stanza, if you wanted to write a ballad, you would want to imitate the style of a ballad, which includes the meter, iambic, and includes the 4 lines, includes no rhyme, and includes 1 line, 2 of the rhyme, 1 and 3 longer than 2 and 4, or whatever it was. That would be something you would want to imitate. We're going to do 3 or 4 ballads. Sometimes the writer will help you out and call it a ballad. Sometimes he won't help you out. You just have to recognize it, because it's going to tell a story, and it's going to have this kind of a certain style that when you read 1 or 2, you'll hear it. There's a certain meter, there's a certain form to it. They always tell stories. If they're folk ballads, then nobody knows who wrote them. They come out of the culture. If they're literary ballads, then somebody's imitating the folk ballad. So that's the ballads. How about anyone? Blank verse. Yeah, Owen.
Verse without rhyme, especially which uses iambic pentameter.
Yeah, and I want you to include the iambic pentameter. I don't know of any blank verse that doesn't use iambic pentameter. Did you have an example?
Yeah, it said, from Shakespeare, to be or to not to be, that is the question, whether it tis nobler in the mind to suffer.
Exactly, those famous speeches, most of which are unrhymed, they're all iambic pentameter, that's what we call them blank verse. The Henry V speech does not have rhyme in it, but it's iambic pentameter. All of Paradise Lost, hundreds plus pages, is written in iambic pentameter. It's the most popular verse, particularly I would think for the long narrative poems like Paradise Lost, because first you have to worry about the rhyme, and the iambic pentameter is the most natural way we've discovered. It's the most natural meter to imitate human speech, so that's why it's useful. Blank verse. Caesura. Anybody? Yeah, please.
I said a break, especially since a pause, usually near the middle of the verse and marked in sketched by a double vertical line.
So it's when something's missing, right? You're expecting something there, and when it's not there, it kind of stands out. I don't know if it's the same. I don't know any technical things about music, but I'm always a Beach Boys fan, and there's a song called "You're Not the Little Girl I Used to Know" or something. It's got a real catchy tune in it. But interesting thing about it, I actually read a review about it one time. In the song, on 2 or 3 occasions, there's a 2 measure. Every measure has 4 beats in this song, 4 times. You know anything about music? So it's 2 of those together. It's 8 beats of silence. So they're singing, all of a sudden nothing, and you're kind of okay. You expect maybe that dramatic pause, and it goes on, and then he picks it up again. I remember someone wrote about it saying that was really daring to do, because you wait too long, you're going to lose your audience. This was a longer pause than normal. But just think, pauses can be just as effective as words. If they come at the right place, the rhetorical power of it, if you stop and pause, it might be more effective than talking through that. Same thing works with the meter. Caesura, I think, speaks to that. Caricature. Anybody? Ella, what'd you get? Caricature.
Said a picture, description, or imitation of a person that is meant to be comical.
Yeah, and usually because it's exaggerated, so it's not realistic. It stresses the comic. Now we're talking about literature, not like artwork. But did you have an example?
I just said her eyes were large and she was glaring.
Yeah, I'm thinking about also some of the characters. Dickens, I think you read this, the first chapter of Hard Times, where it talks about Macchokumchild, the bad teacher. Would you want your son to have Mr. Macchokumchild in the 3rd grade? It's absurd. They're pounding facts into them, and his name. He's choking him. He's not teaching him. He's choking him. It's opposite of bringing life, inspiring. That's a caricature. So Dickens used them in literature. Chiasmus. Have you got it in, Michelle?
I said a literary figure in which words, grammatical constructions, or concepts are repeated in reverse order
Right.
in the same and modified form.
Did you get that? It's terms or in a particular order that are repeated, opposite order. So do you have an example?
I have poetry is the record of the best and happiest moments of the happiest and best minds.
Yeah, you could even hear that. Best, happy, happy, best. Byron said something like sin, pleasure is a sin, and sin sometimes a pleasure. So you take the verse and you flip it. That's chiasm. I actually saw some of that here again. And finally, colloquial. Jessica, have you got that?
The use of information or informal words, phrases, or slang in writing.
Yeah, it's just a good word to use. Remember, that's low diction. Low diction uses colloquial speech. Huck Finn is written in that way. Jack, he's most of the time colloquial. Hawthorne never, unless some of the characters speak colloquially. His prose is very elevated language. Maybe to illustrate this, I didn't realize it at the time, if you have this, and I think you did it, we're not gonna stop to do it, we only have about 10 minutes, but I think we'll read it. The other day, we did one of these, and somebody read it out loud. Even this time, I saw things that I had not seen before. I think hearing it gives you a different perspective. I need somebody to read it. Would you, Rollins? Thank you. And if you haven't done it, I noticed most of you have. Good, that's what I wanted. But you might see something else. We're just practicing. If you can find anything related to diction, syntax, imagery, any of those words we just used, I've seen several here. Let's see what you can find. Go ahead.
Come into my window, opened it, and looked out. There were two wings of the building. There was the garden, there were the skirts of Woolwood. There was the hilly horizon. My eye passes all other objects to rest on those most remote, the blue peaks. It was those I longed to surmount, all within their boundary of rock and heath seemed prison ground. Exile limits. I traced the white road winding round the base of one mountain and vanishing into a gorge between two. How I longed to follow it farther. I recalled the time when I had traveled that very road in a coach. I remembered descending that hill at twilight. An age seemed to have elapsed since the day which brought me first to Lowood, and I had never quitted it since. My vacations had all been spent in school. Mrs. Reed had never sent for me to Gateshead. Neither she nor any of her family had ever been to visit me. I had had no communication by letter or message with the outer world. School rules, school duties, school habits and notions, and voices and faces and phrases and costumes, and preferences and antipathies. Such was what I knew of existence. And now I felt that it was not enough. I tired of the routine of 8 years in one afternoon. I desired for liberty. For liberty I gasped. For liberty I uttered a prayer. It seemed scattered on the wind, then faintly blowing. I abandoned it and framed a humbler supplication for change stimulus. That petition, too, seemed swept off into vague space. Then I cried, half desperate, grant me at last a new servitude.
And we're just trying to look at the art of writing. So what do you notice?
Something I found kind of interesting. I felt like he was using the word I a lot, so I counted it. And he has 21 I's, but only 15 sentences. So he uses at least one I per sentence, sometimes 2 or 3. I just thought that was interesting that he chose to use that word so much.
Can you go beyond interesting? What else does it add? What does that tell you about the
It's a little
subject?
bit of an aphora. It's a way to generally start each sentence to where there's a uniformity throughout the entire paragraph.
And who is the passage about?
The speaker.
The speaker. So, I mean, it's totally focused on him or her anyway. I say him too. It might be a her. I think this might be Jane Eyre again. So it would be a she, but I don't know. I guess by bias, male bias, we just assume male, but Lydia.
Well, I also found a couple more examples of anaphora. Well, at the beginning, like we talked about, there were,
Right.
there was, and then kind of in the middle, he goes school rules, school duties, and school habits,
Mhm.
and notions. And then at the very end, he goes, for liberty I gasped, for liberty I uttered. Not just was, but so.
Can you make something of the volume of repetition of those 3 things you just mentioned? The word there, the word school. There are other places. Can you make anything of what that adds to the content or how that supports the content?
I guess it kind of puts an emphasis on what he wants the reader to focus on, I guess.
But I'm trying to figure out what is it that he wants the reader to focus on?
Oh.
That's what I'm trying to
Oh.
get. Anybody have an idea?
His life.
What about his life?
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, as I was reading it, I felt that the writer they felt like they were being held captive.
Yes.
In what I'm assuming is their school, because they reference
Yes.
it so many times.
it is good.
And I also, the line, 8 hours in one afternoon, I kind of felt like that was, or I interpreted it as, one afternoon feels like an eternity to this person.
And you underestimated, it was 8 years in one afternoon.
Yeah.
So it's even worse,
Sorry.
that's a long afternoon.
Yeah, and so I felt like this person, they felt like one afternoon was an eternity to them, and all they wanted to do was leave, and
Yeah.
that's kind of what I found.
Yes. Lily, you had your hand, I didn't want to go to
Well, I saw
Emma.
two things. First of all, in like the list of the, in like the school rules, school duties. would
The
that be-
repetition again?
Yes, but would it also be like alliteration or maybe, let's see, consonants or something, because it makes that S sound, like school rules, school duties, school habits,
Yeah.
notions.
Does that contribute anything to the meaning?
It's all the same.
What are you getting at?
So like, that, it's the same thing every day for whoever the author is, and then like using the same, like the S sound that Lily said.
It's monotonous.
You hear that? What, she's trying to prove that it's monotonous. How does she prove it? She makes it monotonous. She repeats the same word 5 times, or the word there 4 times. So you see how the repetition is not just some sort of device, arbitrary of meaning. She's trying to imitate how she feels. I feel like school rules, school this, school that, school this, school that, school this. You get it? I was bored with it, just like you are reading this sentence. That's how it works, yeah.
Another clue that the speaker feels like, they're being imprisoned is it says, it was those that long to surmount, all within their boundaries, rock and peaks, and prison ground.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think Clayton mentioned the whole thing sort of has a metaphor, and maybe not just a metaphor, maybe there's some reality to it. This person feels like they're in prison, and you get that in a lot of ways. Yeah, Jessica.
Well, also the same sentence as Lily was talking about, along with the word school, it has rules, habits, notions, voices, spaces, it goes on, and they all have the S sound in it.
Who was it that mentioned the S's? Yeah, Lily, yeah, good. And what are you saying? That's even more S's than we thought.
It's, Lily mentioned it within the same word, but in the same sentence, it's having it throughout the whole sentence within different words.
Yeah, that's really good. Voice says, face says, phrases, costumes. I didn't realize how many S's there are. Again, more repetition, more boredom, I guess you could say. That's just kind of subconsciously trying to tell you that. Yes, Dave.
I feel like there was a kind of desperate attitude throughout the paragraph, because like towards the end it says that, you know, I gasped for liberty, I uttered a prayer, and it seems scattered on the wind, which means like he felt like it never was going to happen.
Yeah, very good. Desperation. Yeah, Lily.
I think it's kind of important that it mentions this person arrived at, down the road leading to the school at twilight. And I think they mentioned this because upon arriving at the school, this person didn't think it would end up feeling like a prison until day, or the light shone on how bad it really was, and how they started to feel like what they saw at twilight was not what they felt in the daytime.
Now, I don't know this for sure, but I think the other passage might have been from the same book. You know, the one about the carriage, and I don't think it's the same person. But somehow but notice it also goes down at twilight. You know, anything going down. Talk about I always have trouble remembering the term archetype. You know, that idea of going down should always bring to you hell, bring to you dungeon, prison, and that's where he's going down at nighttime. Yeah.
Adding on to the twilight thing, it's like, because it's twilight, it's about to turn night, and so this, like, having to stay here at this place without any, it's like night to them.
Yes. Did you, very good. Did you notice maybe the chiasma in the line that says, I desired liberty, for liberty I gasped? Desired, liberty, gasped. It's not exactly the same word, but you see it's the same idea. You have that chiasma.
And not even liberty, but liberty eye, it's always eyes right next to liberty.
Yeah, and going back to what Clay said about how many times? 21 times. And then polysyndeton or whatever it's pronounced, that would also add to that repetition. And, just endless, which is the way he feels. Again, you see how structure and sound contribute to meaning? That's where you want to go. Every time you find a literary term, you can spot it. It's incumbent on you to show what that actually contributes to the meaning. And here, we've been able to do that. One last thing, did you know he wants liberty, but he'll settle for change. If he can't get change, he'll settle for a new servitude. So his expectations are liberty, just something different. Now, just a different slavery. So his expectations are lowered at every mark. Good job. You're reading for Friday. Let's wait for the announcement before we walk out of here. Tomorrow's Decade Day. That's easy for those of us who've seen many decades. It is. I'm going 60 myself.
And I guess your wardrobe has also gone through those decades too, your wardrobe. So.
Yeah, but I have to say one item. Let me shut this off.